Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Nonprofit Show. Thrilled to welcome back Jeffrey R. Wilcox. He's the president and chief learning curator of Third Sector Company. Okay, let's dig into it, Jeffrey, because there is a scarcity mindset, and it's real. How do you see it, and how does it impact us?
Well, Julia, I think the idea of scarcity and abundance have been kind of nomenclature that's been used throughout the nonprofit sector for a number of years. It creates this kind of conversational dichotomy about, are we looking at the glass half full or are we looking at the glass half empty? And it's created this kind of context of, to what degree we're being optimistic or pessimistic about our future. But I will tell you, in the recent years, this idea of abundance and scarcity has taken on a whole new lens. There was a book that was published called Abundance by Derek Thompson. The whole idea of inequities, about some people have access to abundance and another. So this concept has really evolved. But the idea of the scarcity mindset, I believe, has some psychological roots, which talks about we have a preoccupation of being unable or having the roadblocks or barriers to achieve what we can and want to be. And it's that preoccupation that leads to a paralysis, a tunnel vision that basically says there's no way out of this. We are going to be in a certain situation forever. And what it leads to for organizations, and why I think it's so important we talk about this, is it paralyzes our nonprofit sector to become survivalists instead of a sector of possibilities.
Yeah. I love that you said that, because I feel like in some ways it's a luxury to be in an environment where there is an abundance mentality, because it changes everything, but it's really hard to describe it. It's like you feel it.
When you walk into an organization that has a sense of, yes, we can.
Yeah.
We will overcome. We will do this in spite of. There is this sense of we still hold within ourselves the power to make life better for others despite the obstacles. And we formed our nonprofit organizations because we all wanted to see a quality of life, and we were going to see it through whatever it took. There's a determination that I think that is the differential between an organization that is stuck in scarcity and is preoccupied with abundance, is the level of determination to make sure their mission statement is alive, vibrant, progressive, and within reach of most people.
And that is such a big concept.
It is.
I mean, it's such a big concept because, Jeffrey, it seems to me like if you're leading an organization or you're part of an organization with this mindset, it doesn't just start and stop when you walk through the front door of your office or you turn on your computer. It seems like it almost has to be part of who you are as a person going to work every day, right? That's kind of a tough thing.
It is, because there's 3 layers to this. The scarcity mindset begins with how you view the world, because that will begin, in fact, shape how others view it. And then groups will have a shared view. And when that group has an overpowering or a more dominant, not exclusive, Julia, we're not talking about, this is not an either or proposition. The world isn't perfect.
Right.
But we are talking about a predisposition that a person holds that impacts the predisposition of a group, that impacts the predisposition of an organization. And all of my years in the not-for-profit sector, I get very concerned about organizations that are absolutely predisposed with survival to the point that they're losing sight of the possibilities that are right before them.
So then, Jeffrey, what I hear you saying is like, is it a habit? So is like, to boil it down, is the positivity or the negativity, can this be a habit?
It can become a mindset. And I actually, Julia, the idea of this scarcity mindset has gotten the attention of psychologists. And the
Mhm.
word they use is preoccupation.
Ooh, that's a good word. That's a really good word because
Right.
I think I can understand preoccupation. I can digest it better than mindset.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I have not heard that, Jeffrey.
What that preoccupation does, though, Julia, I think, is we walk into organizations and it says our trained response is yes, but, as opposed to yes, and.
And
Our preoccupation is, well, what if instead of what could?
mhm.
Um, it's simple things like that that permeate the way in which we become preoccupied, I think, ultimately with survival. And once a human being or any animal has had their survival instinct touched, it overpowers everything else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's profound and something that is somewhat frightening, Jeffrey, because you can understand the word habit, but preoccupation is a behavior. It seems like maybe we can overcome a preoccupation, but that a habit seems more punitive and harder to move around.
One of the things I think is exciting, Julia, about the nonprofit sector is I would be hard pressed to think of a not for profit organization whose founders did not come together from an abundance mindset.
Hmm.
They didn't have a large pool of capital to do something when they wanted to make sure that every child went to school able to read, that every youngster had access to a musical instrument, that every older person would not leave this world in isolation and malnutrition. The list goes on, that education would be accessible. There was a sense of, yes, we can, and yes, we will, that was the undergirding of our not for profit organizations. And,
Mhm.
and what I will often say to our interims is you have a responsibility to continue to mine that inspiration, because a preoccupation on the infrastructure will absolutely paralyze the inspiration.
Right. And that is such a fabulous way to let everybody understand what the concept is, and at the same time give them permission to inspire to the inspirational aspect of changing, right?
Mhm.
You know,
Right.
I love that. I think that's really a cool way to think about it. And I've got to believe that most people have not thought about it. They just see it as a almost like a miasma that when they walk into the building, like we were saying earlier, it's just a condition, right? Versus rethinking.
It is. It is that mindset that says I have a responsibility to
Yeah.
instruct and to inspire and to inform, so that I can actually lead people to the end game they're seeking for
Mhm.
quality of life in our community.
Mhm. And that's so profound. So let's talk about this leadership and leading with abundance and looking at this in a different way. I mean, you, my friend, you are dealing with a lot of change because you work in this interim space.
Mhm.
Talk to us about the resourced nonprofit and what does that mean and how should we be thinking about this?
So, one of the things that when we work with interim executive directors is my experience, Julie, has told me that when we talk about a resourced nonprofit, most of the people I encounter interpret that to mean the financed nonprofit.
Yeah, me, right. That's what I think of when I saw that. Yeah.
And so there has to be an opportunity to understand on every balance sheet is something called equity.
Mhm.
And what I think we have to do as nonprofit leaders is the resource nonprofit banks on its equity. It is built with people, with institutions, with communities, with each other, with the people who depend on the services you provide. I will often say to an interim executive director, is the goal here to find one person to give you $1 million, Or is the goal here to have 1 million people so excited they each give you $1 so that you have built equity with 1 million people for that organization to have a threshold to thrive?
Yeah.
And that is an extreme concept. I own that. I understand you have to have a variety of sources, but we have to be external facing organizations that are cultivating the equity of the relationships in the community to be what we need to be for others. So many of our interims go into organizations today, they're so inwardly focused, they are losing equity with the relationships that their founders built years ago. That we are not seeing how providing community ownership in the organization is an incredible piece of equity should that organization become in peril. Many of our interims have gone into communities and said, okay, we need for the community to have more ownership in this organization,
Right.
in addition to finding more money for it.
Right. But that, Jeffrey, it's fascinating that you would take us through this line of thought, because when you're like looking at the checkbook and you're thinking there's, the wolves at the door, as they say, it seems like it's really a stretch to say we need to get the community more involved. It seems like we naturally go, we just need to get more rich people involved. And I know that's boiling it down, but that's kind of what I see.
That's called the scarcity mindset.
It is.
It's
That's
the
exactly
scarcity.
it.
That's the scarcity mindset. So
Yeah.
here's a short story. So we had a community festival that had been in a community for a very, very long time. And it had been primarily funded by the city because it had become a backbone of kind of the city's culture, and it played a very important role. But guess what? The city hit deficit, and all of a sudden this event was put into peril.
Mm-hmm.
We provided an interim executive director to this, and they decided, okay, instead of trying to find money, let's cultivate community equity that's been built over the years. 3 things happened, Julia. Here they are. Number 1, the leadership went to the newspaper and said, it's time for a community organization, a community event that's been so beloved to now be owned by the community instead of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, they went on a social media campaign that asked everybody in the community to tell their favorite story about this event. Now, I can personally participate in this because the very first date my wife and I had was at this community event 42 years ago.
I love it. That's great. Yeah, that's great.
The third thing that they did is that they decided to actually get donated billboards in the city that said, instead of asking for $1 million, they asked for space to put a billboard. It was time to have a community event owned by the community and be proud by the community. They were going to close their doors, Juliet. I'm able to tell you, based on this equity building process that the interim executive director did, that festival is still alive and well in this community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super cool. It's such an interesting way to flip the script on something, but ultimately the strength and the value and the future is so much stronger. I mean, for that festival, I mean, to garner the support and the interest of so many different types of people,
yes,
is what creates sustainability.
And language is a very important thing here. And I will say, part of what was really an important concept in a abundance mindset is for boards and executives to understand what leverage really is.
Mm.
And when you begin to realize what your assets are that are beyond your bank account, and you start asking the question, how can we leverage all of that? You're going to get some different solutions. And I will tell you, it comes from abundance mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dig into that. We don't have a lot of time left, but this is really an important concept. And we were talking about this in the green room, and that is the power of specific language and getting everybody rowing in the same direction, meaning getting everybody to use it. Talk to us about what you see about that powerful issue when it comes to language and using words.
So we see this, of course, with interim executive directors, but this is true with any leader. The language that you use over and over again you will begin to understand whether you are being heard or not, because you're going to start hearing those same words from the people around you. So let me give you an easy example. The easy example is if you walk into an organization and constantly talk about it being a quote unquote hot mess or a disaster, or all the verbiage that's out there today, don't be surprised if your volunteers, your staff, and everybody else in the community starts using those same words.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's flip the coin on that. When you come from an abundance ideal, you start using words that others want to hear over and over again. Instead of, catch yourself, every time you use the word problem, what would happen if you just said, let's talk about the possibilities that might be presented in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
Think in terms of possibilities instead of problems, and I will tell you, it will shape it. There's enough books that have been written, Julia, that talk about how the language of the leader is really one of the secret sauces of success.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have just chosen to communicate with people and to interact with people in a way that uses words that creates a connotation of more positivity than reinforcing negativity. This is something I tell our interim executive directors every time they take one of our classes. You can do all you want to, you can learn all you want to, but it is the words that you use to share that learning, to cultivate that learning, to facilitate the transition from your predecessor to your successor. The words you use will be part of the legacy that you leave.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's super powerful. And especially in a time when, frankly, I think a lot of us just civically feel that there's a lot of negativity.
Yes.
Right? I mean, no matter what type of work we're doing in the nonprofit sector, or even let's say the for-profit sector, there's a lot of negative vocabulary. So how long do you do this and model this before you see change? I love that you said start to observe the people around you and if they're using this language. But what's the reality of this, Jeffrey?
Actually, something that resonates with people becomes fairly contagious.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so if I can be quoted as saying, well, Jeffrey would probably say to us, let's stop talking about the problem and let's start talking about the possibility. That tells you something's happening.
Yeah.
But there's other words. And I have to stop here for just a second, Julia, because I think that folks who talk about abundance, back in 1913, Eleanor Porter wrote a book called Pollyanna. And the book was about someone who was overly optimistic.
Yep.
And I think that there's a generation of people who hear the word Pollyannish and don't even know where that word came from. And so if you go back, Pollyanna is kind of a criticism that someone is overly optimistic, and that is a industrial hazard here. Because it isn't about being naive. It is about positioning the possibility as opposed to drowning in the problem. And so, here's a couple of other words that we really encourage our interims to talk about. It is so important today that we talk about gratitude. It's no longer, years ago, back in the day, we talked about recognition and celebration. The word today is gratitude. Are we showing gratitude? How do you know that we are a grateful organization? That is very different than let's throw a party and celebrate.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, so, I like that.
Gratitude is a very important word. Equity is a very important word. Yeah. When you really think about how you describe the environment that you're in, that will help other people to see if you're in the same environment. I very much want a environment where our interim leaders use the word profound. Ooh. I love the word profound being associated with interim leadership because I want interims to use profound processes, profound words. I want them to bring a profound viewpoint on a group of people who haven't seen something for so many years And this new set of eyes has allowed them to see something they have not seen before. C.S. Lewis would have called this a bluespels situation, which means everybody was colorblind, if you will, to the color blue until they saw it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting, Jeffrey, because I believe at the core, especially in the nonprofit sector, our donors, our boards, our staff, and our clients want to be led with positivity. You know,
Mhm.
it's much easier to lean into something that's positive, right? I'm wondering if you see that as well, or this miasma of negativity and lack of abundance. Is it a temporary thing, or it kind of fits in the conversation of how quickly can we realign everybody to this?
My dear friend, I think the word is actually malignancy. I'm
Hmm.
I'm afraid that we are stuck in a scarcity malignancy
Okay.
that for many organizations is absolutely putting them in a survival mode, is disenfranchising a lot of people who want careers in this
Mhm.
profession,
Yep.
that are beginning to lose a sense of hope. And I
Hmm.
do think as a sector, we have responsibility to try and cultivate that. We have a responsibility to try and find that where others can't. That's
Yeah.
that's part of the joy of being in this business.
Right.
And I want our
Right.
leaders, and I particularly want our interim leaders to step up to a responsibility to go back to, some of our founding principles. People came to the not-for-profit sector to find and have hope.
Hmm.
We have to be able to cultivate that with each other if we're going to keep hope.
Hmm.
Now, some will say there's Jeffrey being Pollyannish. No, there's Jeffrey trying to demonstrate abundance theory is something that you have to talk about, you have to put on the table, because if you don't and you're not authentic and intentional about it, it will never be there.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that this becomes not just a mindset and a mode of behavior, but you have to keep reinforcing it to your teams and to your donors and through marketing to the way, you know, the cafeteria staff thinks about
Right.
what their work is, right? I mean, so as a leader, you got to really keep this front and center, right? It's not like a one-off thing.
You do, Julia, and let's go back to the language. I
Hmm.
would start as any executive director or an interim executive director. What does this organization think abundance means? Don't use a word until you know what it means.
Yeah.
And so if we
Wow.
want to start talking about what abundance is, we better agree as a group, number one, what we think it is, and number two, our responsibility to lean into it when appropriate.
Hmm. I love that. And I've got to believe that it's going to be a little different for everybody, right? Until you get like a common approach.
That's exactly right. But it comes down to language. And then you also have to have the
Mhm.
conversation about, folks, what does it mean to have a scarcity mindset? And does this organization exhibit that kind of behavior? And is that the kind of environment that we want? And
Right.
we recognize that we are in a position of trying to close gaps. That's part of what we do. We understand this is hard work. But
Mhm.
until you have the conversation about, okay, how do we lean more into and be centered from an abundance point of view and try
Mhm.
and not have the gravitational default pull to scarcity? That is a retreat. That is an ongoing leadership discussion. That's abundance
Mhm.
theory in action.
Yeah, so interesting. I swear I'm going to start calling you Jeffrey Sensei Wilcox. We're going to get rid of the R and just add the word sensei in because I always love, um, I feel like a lot of what you say is very commonsensical, that it's like, okay, yeah, but we need to kind of bring it back because it's so easy to go away from it, right? Until we kind of like, whoa, okay, wait, let's refocus. So really cool words of wisdom today. And I think it's a magical way to be thinking about our organizations. You said something really powerful in the green room to me, and you said I think that this is a huge part of burnout. that if people had this more positive, abundant mindset, they could get through and get to different opportunities. And I had never really looked at it like that. Because yeah, who wants to go into down to the salt mines every day, right? When it's just so negative. So fascinating work. Jeffrey R. Wilcox, really one of the great thinkers, thought leaders in our nation when it comes to these types of things. He's led a fascinating life of leadership himself. And as the CEO of Third Sector Company, check them out. A really interesting approach to leadership, what's going on in our sector right now. As Jeffrey and so many folks from his team have reminded us, change is going to happen. Leadership change is going to happen. So don't wait for it to happen to you. Be thinking about how things change and what you and your organization might do. You can learn more about their work at thirdsectorcompany.com. Really quickly, you have some training opportunities coming up.
Well, we have our nationally acclaimed Interim Executives Academy coming up in October. There'll be 3 opportunities for people. You don't even have to be an interim. If you would like to learn a way to bring a different approach, a new kind of beginning to your organization, we'd love to have you in the Interim Executives Academy.
Well, hint, hint, I'm kind of signed up for it. Yeah. So, because I'm like all in, I'm into this big time. I think this is huge. So yeah, so I think I'm going to be a part of one of those cohorts. I'm very excited about it. So anyway, okay, hey everybody, great episode, great information. And again, we have amazing partners that allow us to talk about these things. And they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, our friends over at Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that join us day in and day out. Jeffrey, I love my conversations with you. You just always get me buzzing and thinking about new things. So thank you for that powerful leadership that you provide to me. So I say thank you.
Wow, thank you.
Hey, we leave each and every episode of the Nonprofit Show with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.